Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to London Dialogues. We are trying to create a series here, a platform for Indic voices in London, and we welcome everyone who's joined so far. There will be a few more people trickling in, but Harsh, Rajeev will start. So what we have today with us are two investment experts, policy commentators, and now very proud co-author of much raved about book, A New Idea of India. So congratulations to both of you, Harsh and Olivia. Please pick the book up and show that covers. Congratulations to both of you, Harsh and Rajeev, for your publications and the first book, and much talked about and getting a lot of praises and some criticism also, I believe. So off the rack, I'll just jump into these questions. So I have been reading you, both of you, for quite some time. You have been writing essays and articles and publishing in very reputed publications. How, from there, this whole journey of putting that into a book came about? How two of you, an INSEAD MBA and Columbia University MBA, essentially into financial markets, come together to put a book on a new idea of India?
So we started Nilendra as writers, as columnists with different newspapers. In fact, I think we had published a few columns individually, and then we started collaborating after we had met, I think in 2009. And then coming from the financial sector, coming from the investment world, I think it just flows naturally in the sense that if you're an investor in India, you're trying to make sense of the country from a macro perspective, right, before you drill down into kind of micro themes, industries and sectors. So both of us, I think, had that kind of a orientation, and also obviously a passion for India, kind of a love for the country and so on. Right. And as we were writing, then there was a large collection of columns which we initially had thought that could make for an interesting anthology. And as we started that project, then that kind of flowed into something else. It became much more expansive as the themes sort of came together, and it sort of evolved itself, I would say, into what is now the book in everyone's hands. And it was, I would say, a very organic kind of process. I don't think either of us thought 10, 11 years ago that we're going to have a book in 10 years or something like that. Just flowed from like our own thoughts into columns and blog posts, and then from there into longer essays in some more sort of academic-ish type of journals, and then from there, some of our mentors like Sanjeev Sanyal and Amish, they actually also encouraged us that you should consider writing a book now, and that's how we kind of got the confidence and idea to actually move ahead on this path.
Right. So what is this idea of India that two of you are putting across, and why now there's a time to rethink what is India and what is the idea of India?
Okay, so thank you once again, Nilendra, and thank you to Gautam and Indic Academy UK for having me and Rajeev on to discuss A New Idea of India book. So I think a new idea, first of all, we say this is a new idea of India. We don't say this is the new idea of India.
It's not the idea,
This is our perspective, one of many ideas. But even a new idea of India always has to build on something which already exists, right? So in that sense, it obviously builds on, as we say, the civilizational heritage of the book. So it's basically a new tweak on old material. It's a new way to package it. And the subtitle of the book is Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. So that, in a way, that subtitle of the book is a good way to start explaining what the new idea is. We basically are saying that we have to look at, in social and political terms, citizens as individuals, as far as the government, the state, the law is concerned, and not as groups. Society might see them as groups, that's fine. So that's the idea on the social political side. And related to that idea is individual economic freedom, which we cover in the second half of the book, which requires, in turn, good governance, good state capacity, individual economic freedoms, that is free markets, we think is the best way to create prosperity. However, with a couple of caveats, you do need redistribution. The idea is the redistribution, such as good schools, should happen through market incentives like school choice. You do need good regulation. And you also need something to leverage the size of the country. So while we are all individuals, and there are some downsides to be a very giant country in terms of governance inefficiencies, there are also a lot of upsides if you play it well. For example, you have collective bargaining power in terms of incentivizing multinationals to invest and manufacture in India if they want this giant market. So there is some case for industrial and trade policies there. But broadly speaking, the general rule is to have more individual freedom, both socially and economically. But there are caveats on the civilizational side in the sense that you want to leverage the economic size of the country, and on the social size, you do not start poking holes into the very system, into the very culture and the ethos of civilization, rather, that makes these individual freedoms possible. So that kind of reflexivity and struggling with that is what we try to convey in this book.
So yeah, obviously the idea of any country is an evolving process. You are not going to have a static idea for any nation at any point of time. You bank your idea on a philosophy that it's a civilizational state here, right? So just for the understanding of the audience, what do you mean when you call a country a civilizational state? And then I would also come and ask you about the counter question on that. So let's start with, what is the civilizational state we talk about? Rajeev. Yeah.
So in a nutshell, in a nutshell, I would say, for a lot of people say or claim that India was created in 1947.
Right.
Before that, it was just a collection of communities. There is a popular book called, I think, attributing it to Nehru. The title is The Invention of India.
Right. The discovery.
So I think Shashi Tharoor wrote that book called The Invention of India, and in a way, it's like about Nehru's contribution and so on.
Right.
So the idea being that Nehru sort of had created the country. He gave us democracy, and it all happened in 1947, and then 1950 the Republic was born, and so on. But our thesis is that India was not created in 1947. India is a very ancient civilization, ancient culture, or what we can say, Prachin Sanskriti or Sabhyata.
Right.
In Hindi. The events of 1947 and 1950 were just one milestone in a very long history. The Republic, which was formed in 1950, even that kind of acknowledged the civilizational roots of the land that is Bharat.
Right.
So, which is why we one of the kind of sections in the book is titled, the idea a civilizational republic. So, we think that India is unique in the world, where a civilization also coincides with a kind of a geographic nation state in the way that India is, and it's a civilizational republic. That too is also unique because China is a civilization state, but it's not really a republic.
Yep.
Right? Definitely not a democratic republic. And there are hardly any other examples. People can maybe you can say that Israel is another kind of civilizational republic.
Japan probably is can be called as
India is unique in the world in that sense.
Yeah,
sorry, which one?
Japan, I was saying, can probably be called a civilizational state in some sense.
Yeah, Japan too. Japan, Israel, a few examples like that.
Yeah.
Wait, so just to add to what Rajeev said. So basically, one way to understand the word civilization is to think of the largest section of humanity, the largest coherent section of humanity, which is short of all of humanity itself. Right. So why is that definition relevant? That definition is relevant because we often use the word the West, the West as a civilizational construct, but the West refers to the United States, Canada, Western Europe, including the UK at the very minimum, if not also Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and in that sense of term, West might also refer to New Zealand and Australia, which is not
exactly.
West.
So which is got nothing to do with the geographical West. Australia is also very much included in it. That's a very good point. So therefore, the West is a civilization construct, but it is made of many nation states.
True.
However, India and China are the only large examples, the only relevant examples in which these large civilizations more or less coincide with one nation state. Right. And then, as Rajeev mentioned, even within those two examples, India is the only democratic republic. So India is the only kind of civilizational republic that we have. Like France and the US are part of the West, but they are separate states.
Right.
Even if Europe becomes, or Western Europe or the European Union becomes kind of federal superstructure state in 5-10 years, they have a kind of centralized budget. Now that Brexit has happened, the West will still remain that European Union plus US plus the smaller countries of Canada, Australia, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So even then, it will not be kind of one civilization. Although in a few decades from now, who knows? So in that sense, India is very unique, and it's the reason why that is so important and so often missed is because it is, for example, okay for Western liberal commentators, and just the name with the way I'm using it, the Western.
Yeah.
Western बोलने से चलता है. Dharmic commentators, it sounds sectarian to a lot of people. It sounds narrow. It sounds, to some people,
Yes.
it might sound bigoted, right? So,
Yeah.
and
True.
Financial Times correspondents might write the West in a completely unself-conscious manner.
Yeah.
Right? But
Like
if we
a
say,
very honest manner, like not
matter of fact,
degenerating anyone,
but
or yeah.
there's no connotation, just a denotation, just a matter of fact.
Yes. Yeah.
But if we write India the civilization, then especially of late, the last few decades, all kind of people start saying, "Oh my God, what is this person saying?" All the antenna go up. So,
True.
there is an element of what we assume, what we don't assume, and what we are normalized to, what we are used to thinking of. And therefore, while we say that the Nehruvian construct of India is not civilization, although Nehruji himself saw India as a civilization, and this was
Right.
not a very kind of strange idea in 1947. Ironically, with the so-called founding fathers of the republic, today it's only kind of reduced to a BJP position. And my point is, that's good for the BJP, sure, politically.
Yeah.
That's not good for India if there is no consensus on this.
True. So one criticism of this civilizational state topic you picked up directly, that there's a direct denial that there was no state per se before 1947. The other criticism generally comes when somebody talks about civilizational state or Indic state per se, is that are we just holding on to our past and not trying to move ahead? What's the point of just harking on to that past, right? So how do you address that criticism? Is there's a positive contribution of being a civilizational state, or if I could rephrase that, how does it matter to govern a nation?
So I think on holding on to the past and stuff, that I think allegation doesn't really hold water, because if we are talking about fundamentalism, let's talk about the fundamentals. The very opening chapter of our book, we quote from the Rig Veda, the creation hymn as it is called,
right.
The Nasadiya Sukta. And if you read that hymn, it is full of skepticism.
Right.
And it is essentially saying, who knows whether even the gods may not know that where did this world come from, etc., etc. So it is full of this, as we write in the book, it would even gladden the hearts of even physicists and scientists.
True.
That this is their kind of what is considered today as a religious scripture.
Yeah.
Right.
It's full of scientific skepticism. Right. It ends with saying that we never know.
Yes, exactly. So
yeah.
So if we adopt that kind of a mindset, are we really becoming static? I don't think so.
True.
In fact, we are engendering a certain skepticism about the world, and at a high level, if we have that kind of a mindset, automatically one becomes oriented more towards what again in the book we've described as having a slightly scientific orientation bent of mind, as opposed to a dogmatic bent, where you are automatically more open-minded, right? You're saying that this can also happen and maybe that can also happen, so let's see how it works. That's the kind of approach. So right. I don't necessarily see harking back to the past as something regressive in the way it is portrayed by a section of commentators or analysts.
Yeah, so definitely. When you have a past, what somebody would say harking back to the past can also be said as taking a strength from the past and building upon it.
That high level philosophy is certainly something, I think it's completely in sync with scientific temperament. What is, or but then again, that's high level philosophy. You can always find one or two people who are pulling in something absurd and then saying that this is what we should do because this is how it was done 2,000 years ago or 500 years ago.
Right.
But naturally, I mean that's where we have to apply our sort of skeptical hat, wear our skeptical hat, and apply our common sense and see that maybe it worked then, it doesn't work now. And take a slightly rational kind of approach like that.
True, true.
I'll just
So,
add
yeah, Harsh.
one correction to Nilendra what you mentioned earlier. So it's not necessarily that we had a unified state earlier. So the sentence that we use in the book is India is an ancient civilization that is being converted into a young nation through
Right.
the instrumentality of a democratic unified state. So
Mhm.
earlier culturally, more importantly, civilizationally, we were one. Even if we were under different rajas, or for that
Yeah.
matter, nawabs, even if we spoke different languages. But you could go from Rajasthan north to Badrinath, or you could go to Dwarka, and you would feel that you're in the same Devbhumi, right?
Right, right, right.
You did not need to have one state the way China, for
Mhm.
example, at least Eastern China did. More or
Yeah.
less, they also had civil wars, more or less for 2,000 years. So the Chinese civilization history is very much state centered, whereas Indian civilizational history is not at least a unified state centered. So there
Right,
are different
right.
and there are differences the way it has it's very path dependent. Now on to the point of why it matters. It matters because any person or individual or community or nation or civilization that does not understand its history will make
Mhm.
mistakes about the future. Like we have to understand where
True.
we are coming from to understand where we are going, why
Where are
we are
we
going.
going?
I mean, for example, if we discuss any controversial issue today, like the CA debates rocked us
Right,
before the Delhi
right.
riots. How do you
Mhm.
take a kind of a how do you see the wider arc of history if you do not understand where we are coming from, right? I mean, you can otherwise people will say let's contextualize based on these legal promises, which are also interpretations. Any legal promises and interpretation. Why not understand? For example, even pre 47, there's something called partition
But,
happened.
but Harsh,
Uh,
if I can make a point there, okay.
yes.
But we often see that the criticism comes from that perspective that why are we looking at? So when you put CA, a lot of people critical of it refuse to look even beyond 1990s and forget the
Right.
civilizational history. They say what's happening now, like 5 years, 10
So
years.
my point is, my reply to that is very simple. First of all, people do not have to agree with you or me or Rajeev or Gautam,
Right.
right? But
Yeah.
the point is very simple. This, even if you want to think that you want to oppose the CAA, the best way to oppose CAA is to by appealing to the best instincts of Indians, which is rooted in their civilization heritage. If you give them a very legalistic argument for a constitution that has been amended 100 times and that was under a dictatorial emergency for 2 years, and the words socialism and secularism were added to the constitution when the opposition politicians were in jail, it is
Mhm.
difficult to have the moral weight as opposed to if you appeal to their moral instincts grounded in thousands of years of their religion is a very minor part of it, their broad
Right.
civilizational worldview. Actually, even if
Mhm.
you want to oppose it, that's the best way to oppose it. So we need
Yes.
that common lingua franca that understands, which is why I'm again saying this civilization heritage should be a bipartisan issue. Ideally, it should not be a single party issue, because then within that framework we can disagree.
Right, right, right. So earlier you mentioned India is a unique country in the world, being a civilizational republic, right? But there are other civilizational states. How this identity of civilizational republic fits into the worldview in terms of when you are kind of doing business with other countries or interacting with other countries. So relation between two civilizational states or relation between civilizational state and nation state. Does that come into picture?
Should I take that, Rajiv?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah,
Okay,
any of it.
so I think that's an excellent question of all kind of angles of foreign policy, economic policy, and trade. I'll just give you a small example, right? When Narendra Modi tries to counter China putting a string of pearls around India, and he, for
Mhm.
example, goes to Mongolia, one of the common points he brings up in Mongolia is the Buddhist heritage of the two countries,
Right.
right? So when he tries to attract tourists from Japan, there is a Buddhist circuit being kind of made just analogous to the Hindu Char Dham,
Right.
right? So there are even with Sri Lanka.
There's also that one example, Harsh, where I think the UP government reached out to South Korea
Yes.
because
Yeah.
I think many
Ayodhya
many
connection.
centuries or millennia ago, there was a princess from South Korea who had, by way of marriage, come to India,
Yes.
and the UP chief minister invited uh, like a delegation from South Korea to come to Ayodhya.
So my point is the Westphalian system of modern nation states, which has extreme benefits in many ways, is still very much a
Mhm.
17th century invention. It first happened in Europe, then after colonization and decolonization, it spread to the rest of the world, right? That is the modern nation state system we live in, and it has many benefits. But people's emotional histories, their sense and sentiments are by definition older than that, right? Especially for old Asian and European cultures where they remember things from 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Even a place like Persia, which remembers its pre-Islamic history. Right. So even today, India says it's a bit of hyperbole, but India and Iran have civilizational links. It might not mean much today, but they still say it, right? So I think it is basically soft power in a way, and no soft power is useful unless it is incorporated within a set of hard power. But once the hard power is there, the soft power is extra bonus. Like as people say in parts of India, कि आप ₹1 का नोट फेंकते हो तो आवाज नहीं होती, उसके साथ अगर एक पैसा और फेंकते हो तो आवाज ज्यादा होती है. So like ₹1 और एक पैसा कम है रुपया से, but पैसे से आवाज होती है. So it's the extra linkage, which is often the difference in key relationships.
Right. So this is all at a very strategic level, right, on the governance level and on relational. Sure. You were saying something, Rajeev?
No, and I was saying, Neelendra, let me give one more example, actually. Something I came across recently on how this civilizational angle manifests itself. Sometimes we don't even see it when it's in front of our eyes. So, if you look at the official Gazette notifications of India, there are 2 dates that are given. So every Gazette notification has 2 dates. One is the Gregorian calendar date.
Right.
And the other date that is given in India's official Gazette is the Shaka calendar.
Yeah.
So that calendar actually is still followed in parts of Bali and Java and Indonesia.
Right.
And it is in a way the national calendar of India, in a sense. It's the I mean, we don't follow it in practice in Indian life, common life in India, because we all on the Gregorian calendar system, right? We follow the months of January through December, days, Sunday through Monday, obviously, and so on. That's the Gregorian system. But there's an ancient calendar which India had, which is still the Gazette.
Much use in a lot of part of India.
That calendar.
So just a couple of points there. First of all, some of that calendar dates in Indian is still used for puja paddhati perspective. And secondly, how does civilization state matter? A very simple example is we allow Nepali citizens to work, live, and study in India.
Right.
We don't allow it for Pakistanis to even visit much easily. And Bangladesh is a halfway case, closer to Pakistan, but it's much more liberal in terms of travel because there is less kind of tension between India and Bangladesh.
Right.
But only Nepal gets all its citizens to live, work, and study in India. And now take a wild guess why that is the case. While we might not like to say it and kind of acknowledge it openly, but there is a clear reason why that is the case. And even Bhutan is a much smaller example, but Nepal is the best example of that.
Yeah.
And Sri Lanka, which tried to be very kind of cozy with China, the way Nepal tried the last few months ago. Even Sri Lanka, I must say that after the terror attacks that I think happened last year, there is a clear bipartisan consensus in Sri Lanka, which kind of moved towards India and away from Pakistan, and to some extent even away from China. So the point is, these emotional connections have, even without Rajeev and me calling it a civilizational state, have always been there. That is why we've treated Nepal very differently than any other country.
And when was the Gazette of India formalized, right? This format of the Gazette of India, it was formalized in 1955.
Yeah.
Right.
Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister of India.
Right.
Nehru was the Prime Minister of India. Why did they feel the need to include this in the Gazette?
Oh yeah, well, on that matter, the cover of your book is it's a civilization. Yeah, right.
This is from the fundamental rights section of the original constitution.
Right.
It's Ram, Lakshman, and Sita.
Right. So it's not something that we dropped. Like the idea of civilizational state is not something we dropped immediately after when independent nation. It's more of a recent phenomena when people are questioning that idea.
More of an 80s, 90s thing when it happened, and then there is a counter reaction now in the last few years.
Right. So what I was saying is that this is all at a very strategic level, on a governance level. What does it mean to be an individual, and how does it impact somebody in the 21st century living in India? Is that their nation has been a civilizational republic, or probably a civilizational federal structure, essentially, in the earlier times? So how does it affect them in a tactical way in their day-to-day life? how their rights are affected, or what responsibilities do they take when they're part of the civilizational state?
It's a fascinating question, and there are all kind of counterfactuals around that. But let us
Yeah.
say for a moment that we were not united this in this civilization state. Multiple things could have happened. First of all, we would never have been able to leverage our size for economic investment. We could have been much more like sub-Saharan Africa in that sense, because only
Yeah.
Africa signed a free trade union literally last year, I think, or this year,
Right.
with Nigeria being the final person who signed it. Even today, it'll take many years for it to properly fructify. So that's on the economic side. On the political side, imagine if West Bengal was one country or Gujarat was one country. It would have been much easier for these so-called countries then to be dictatorships. In a way, the diversity and democracy in India, diversity including within the dharmic sphere, has actually made us much more amenable to democracy, including our own ancient heritage again from the Lichavi Republic, Vaishali, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So when we are saying the world's largest economy, will be the world's economy, the largest number of people as global economic convergence happens. India and China were the largest economies for most of history. So
right.
then who do we credit? We credit our size. Who do we credit for our size? Contrary to popular jokes of Indians having a lot of kids, actually Indian, Chinese, and European populations over 500 years as a rough proportion is the same.
Yeah.
Is that actually the Europeans rose first in the first few centuries, and now Indians and Chinese have kind of risen, and the overall proportion has remained the same. So why is India one entity so relatively easily? I think therefore the credit to that has to go to the civilizational heritage, and therefore the life of an individual could be much better in India than say isolated Pakistan in 10 years from now, or already is.
Right.
It's much easier to do a tech startup in India given the large market. You can't do a small startup for different countries that easily.
Right.
So there are many ways to think of it. Rajeev, I'm sure, has many. I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's a counterfactual.
You have something to add, Rajeev?
No, so I think it's just I think individuals should be allowed to view themselves in whatever way they please. If I really had to boil it down in very simple terms, that's what I would say. And individuals should not be forced by the state to self-identify as this or that. For the purposes of the state, every Indian is just an individual. Instead of identifying as, let's say, member of a religious group or something else. Because I think that idea is actually I would argue in perfect consonance with the kind of dharmic identity, the dharmic sort of ethos of India.
So let me phrase this next question. It's going to be a challenge for me to put this question together. But when we talk about civilizational state, we are talking about a broad common identity. But within that identity, when we are moving to individuals, right, we are taking a very classical liberal approach of every individual having very independent rights to them, right? Whereas when you talk about a kind of common identity, that's a more of a left liberal approach, that individuals, more than their own personal freedom, belongs to a group which should have rights, right? So while we are talking about, bear with me, okay, I'm just trying to put this together. So while we are talking about a big identity here and talking everyone as a group, we are still going to a very classical approach of individual freedom. How you bring these two together, talking about identity yet individual freedom?
So I think the very simple way to look at that is, you need the big identity to protect the small individual identities. It's not left liberal, because the left liberal group says within a country they look at different groups.
Right.
We are talking at the meta country civilizational level. So, for example, this is the kind of debate that would happen between, as you said, classical liberal, like somebody, Robert Nozick on the libertarian side versus John Rawls on the classical or more of a soft left liberal side. And John Rawls would say everybody should have all these rights, but no identity as such, And then Robert Nozick would say which state would kind of impose that order. And then people like me and Rajeev would jump and say, okay, if there is a state that imposes the order, what underlines that state? What keeps that state going? Right. So there is a state which hires police and which makes sure that classical freedoms are maintained for most of the people. Then what is that keeps the state together, the people together, that whole machinery running? Does it break down in some extreme cases? We actually write that in the book in a section called Kashmir, Pakistan, and Karl Popper. right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are, so the way, so it is, there is a lot of overlap with classical liberalism in the default setting, but
Right.
it is in the exceptions where we disagree from the classical liberal, or even more broadly the liberal framework or terminology itself. I mean,
Right.
except if you were to include people like Karl Popper in a broader sense,
Mm-hmm.
because we say we reserve the right to not be tolerant towards the intolerant. You know, if the overall setting, the framework, the operating system that lets these individual freedoms kind of flourish and prosper, if that
Right.
framework becomes under attack, and not just under trivial attacks, this
Mm-hmm.
should not be an excuse. It should be used rarely, but like a real attack, for example, the way the war is happening in Kashmir, that is constant terrorist subversion from the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. There are real problems, or for example, the Maoist insurgency, which Manmohan Singh called the biggest internal security threat, right?
Sure.
Real problems like that, you have to be at least ready, not happy, but at least
Mm-hmm.
be ready to suspend individual freedoms, to defend individual freedoms. The way that sounds Orwellian, but that's what Abraham
Yeah,
Lincoln
yeah,
did. That's what Abraham Lincoln did to in terms of suspending habeas corpus for the
yeah.
U.S. to win the Civil War, and the U.S. then became the largest guarantor of individual freedoms in the coming century. You know, after
Right.
after desegregation and all that. So there are no easy choices. You know, in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But when there are clashes, it's not the, to answer your question, it's not a classical liberal philosophy in that sense. There are
Right.
exceptions where it break down and where we disagree with that worldview.
Mm-hmm. So, will it be safe to say that what's happened when you are looking at a broader civilizational identity, it is actually taking away the smaller fault lines, which probably give people more freedom to move around in the larger sense of the word within that construct, right? Right.
Rajiv, you want to take this? Rajiv, you're mute. You're on mute.
I
You're
was
on
saying,
mute, Rajeev.
yeah. So again, the question becomes, what are the fundamentals of the civilizational identity that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So if we agree that the fundamentals are about freedom,
Right.
about liberty, and that's the case that we've made
Mm-hmm.
in the book, that in a sense I mean, put slightly differently, the book is about reconciling individual rights with in the ancient dharmic ethos. So if you agree that that is the case, then I don't think there's
Mm-hmm.
any problem, because I don't think that sort of mobility that you're mentioning, individual
Yeah.
mobility or freedom, is in any way in conflict with the ethos of India.
No, no, true. I was making that point. That's what I was saying.
No,
That we can.
I understand, Nilendra. I'll answer your question. So basically, you were saying that in a way, do we want?
Harsh?
Yeah, exactly. Can you hear me?
I think there's a lag with Rajiv. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, Harsh.
I can hear you guys. So I'm saying, Nilendra, you're absolutely right that in a sense, we actually write about melting pots and salad bowls in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what we are saying is the government should see people as individual citizens. Societies should be free to see them as groups.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see people as groups, you have some kind of moral pressure on them not to be too mobile, not to be too flexible, not to cross certain boundaries. But our case is, so long as the government sees them as individual citizens, and if there is a revolt or if there is some churn or change and reform internally within the society after that extent, we should not
Mm-hmm.
stop it. It does not necessarily
Right.
mean that we should even necessarily go and do it.
Mm-hmm.
So we are not necessarily arguing for an interventionist state. We are saying
Yeah.
the government should not at least slow it down.
Right.
Because the natural process of freer markets, education. See, also what is happening is we actually use the character of a young woman to say that she's studied in one city and she's born in another city, she's working in another city, she's married to a person from yet another city, and we're using real life modern examples from India because what has happened is it's very easy for me to go from Kolkata to Mumbai to Bangalore to Delhi to Hyderabad and Pune. Because there is a certain kind of national culture which has developed because of technology,
Right.
because of movies, because of digital, because of a general sense of who we are. The same kind of cultural references. IPL is a classical example of you and I can kind of just meet and have small banter over and kind of have a mock fight over the teams we support, and that kind of common culture is a very recent creation in a way. Earlier the common culture was at the elite level. For example, the IAS and before that even the Congress, the Indian National Congress from 1885, was basically a collection of lawyers and educated professionals at the very high level from Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and Delhi, right? And what happened is only after Gandhiji did it become a mass movement. and
Yeah.
then the ICS, and then the IAS. You could have a Bengali guy being posted in Gujarat or vice versa. And now that thing is multiplied by orders of magnitude, and with the private sector thrown in, that I don't know where Nilendra is from. We've spoken before the call went live. I never asked you which state you're from,
Yeah.
which is perfectly fine to ask. But I definitely
Right.
did not ask you your caste or your background, or it. Not that I was even curious. It did not even kind of
Right.
cross my mind. Right. I was much more interested in what you're doing in London right now. So I think that change is something that even it's not gone through all of India yet. So let's not overstate the case. It's something that's happening, but it is much more than 30, 40 years ago. And the thing that Rajeev and I keep on saying in the book is that the economic and social are related because they reinforce each other. So you have more economic freedom and prosperity, you have more social churn and mobility, which in turn creates scope for a larger national coherent market. Because if you talk to marketers, they would say, till 20 years ago, they would say you need very different state advertising campaigns.
Right.
And that might still be true for parts of South India or Bengal, but maybe from UP to Madhya Pradesh to parts of Maharashtra and Gujarat. I'm just making a hypothesis.
Yeah.
It may not. Maybe a similar campaign can now work. Like Deepika Padukone and Virat Kohli might be national icons now, right? So in that sense, our common imagination is much more common than it used to be. And therefore, and across not just caste or region, but across gender, like women are much more freer. We talk about like a don't ask, don't tell incipient sexual revolution in India, which in turn undermines kind of caste boundaries and regional boundaries. So there's an entire kind of churn that's happening in India, which is, in a very Indian sort of way, where, the ghar ke parents bolte hain, acha mujhe batana mat. It's like, we don't talk too much about it, but that churn is happening, And I think that's very fascinating because most people who write about India are often not in India, right? And Indian academics we are so in that Indian environment, we kind of miss it. But I think it's a fascinating social change accelerated 5 to 10 times faster compared to what happened in the West 100 years ago.
True. No, what you're saying is very relatable for me because I have lived all over India, and at no point when I moved to study somewhere or to work somewhere, I even had a sense of, the idea that I'm going to a new place, in the sense I had when I moved to London or when I moved to Malaysia to work. That sense never happened when I moved to Bangalore to work.
So the way it works now is, you're living in Calcutta, then let's say you move to Bangalore, your bank remains the same, your retail store is the same, your telecom service provider is the same.
Swiggy and Amazon and Flipkart is the same,
you're the same kind of brands. So in a kind of consumer sense, you feel like you're in the same place. Well, was that true 30, 40 years ago? Probably not.
Right. So it's at that level also, and I think another is that level is that we have a very underlying sense of being part of the same group, right? We probably not verbally state that. We, on a very surface level, we might see Bihar and Bengal and Karnataka as different state, and we see people as differently. But at an underlying level, we have a sense that it's the same place. I'm just going to another city in my own country, among my own people. Right. So from there, on a very uniting factor, we'll move to something which gets people in the knots. You have a chapter called "Saving Secularism from Secularists." Let's talk. I'm not posing a question. Just talk about Indian secularism here and what's happening there, what's wrong, where we have gone wrong with the secularism in India.
No, so I think the single biggest problem with secularism as it is practiced in India, I mean, there's no problem with secularism per se, but the problem with secularism as practiced in India and as propounded in India is that is not, in law and in practice, it is about treating different religions differently.
Right.
Is that really secularism? It's actually a very Orwellian construction of.
So I have a very strong opinion on this subject, right? So I'm just putting that out there.
What is properly understood as secularism? I don't even think all the Western sort of writers, commentators who keep sort of hyperventilating often on the subject, I don't even think they know what is actually happening. Are they aware of the kind of religion-based discrimination that Indian governments have been practicing for so many decades? And actually the chapter that you mentioned, Nilendra, in the book, the third chapter, the title is "Saving Secularism from the Secularists."
Yeah.
And we tried to make a pretty pointed case that it's time to change this, and it's time to move to a regime of individual rights where Indian citizens have equality before the government. They have the same laws, and the government should not differentiate between citizens.
Right, right. So where I come from on that topic is the very fundamental secularism came into existence because in West you had countries or states having a common joint on the top, like religion and governance were both managed by essentially the same set of people. And thus the idea of secularism came in, which essentially was never the case in India. By introducing secularism, that's my take on it, that by introducing secularism, you actually brought government into the religious space, and then you asked government to somehow do monkey balancing between different group of people, and thus you just sabotage secularism, what was existing essentially.
No, I've heard that point often, and I disagree with that point. There's
Okay.
people who say that basically secularism is a Christian or a post-Christian idea. Yes, of course, it kind of the practice came by separating religion and state in European countries, especially after the Catholic Protestant civil wars across the continent, right? So that's the genesis of secularism. But the reason why India still needs some separation of the right word in Hindi is panth nirpeksh, not dharm nirpeksh.
Right,
it's panth nirpeksh, and I think even Yogi Adityanath makes that point, and many BJP politicians have made the point. You cannot be dharm nirpeksh, you cannot be value neutral.
Yeah.
But you have to be path neutral. There's a difference. And the reason I'm saying is, the Abrahamic religions have anyways been in India for at least 1,000 years, if not more, right? I mean, for almost 15 centuries, if you include some early Christians and Muslims, almost 2,000 years, depending on what date you cut off. So once you have that set up in India, you need a apparatus so that all religions are kept aside as far as the government is concerned. And then people say, well, even assume for a moment there are no Abrahamic religions. King Harsha used to give grants to Buddhists and Shaivites and Vaishnavites in Prayag or whatever. Well, the point is, even the largest Indian states are not as large as the state today we have. And they were not as intrusive and powerful, and they did not have as much tax revenue. So even if you ignore Abrahamic religions for a moment, proselytizing two Abrahamic religions, Islam and Christianity, and if you do not have a separation of religion and state, so let's go by the meaning of the term and not the term, because the term has become toxic. Even Rajeev and I, while we talk about saving secularism, we are not very enthusiastic about the term itself because the term has become toxic. So let's talk about just separating religion and state. So let us say even if we did not have Abrahamic religions and there was a Hindu government, would you want them to control temples, even if there was no Muslims and Christians? Yes or no?
No.
If no, then that is separation of religion and state. So then that is secularism, genuine secularism. And if yes, then the question is, would we end up favoring one kind of temple sect sampradaya over the other? So there are deep issues. But you're right in the sense, to the point that by having this perverted definition of secularism, we ended up destroying it. But
so that's the point I was trying to make, that by putting the secularism in this sense there, we have actually brought government into the setup where they were.
I was just disagreeing with the part of the Christian origin, because even the United States has a separation of religion and church, but it does not do what India does, right? So in fact, in many Hindu temples are much better run in New Jersey than they are in New Delhi.
True.
Like you can go to Hindu temples in America, they're beautiful, they're gorgeous. Right, they're absolutely well maintained, no problems at all, and I'm sure in the UK as well. But definitely in the US, like I've been astonished. Of course, Indian Americans are a very rich community and all of that, but I was blown away by the beauty of the temples, how clean they were, how well managed they were. Right, and so there is something to be said about just separating these two realms, even if it is a kind of post-Christian idea, because anyways, Abrahamic thought process and religions are in India as well now for a long time. But what is very important is आप secular बोल भी रहे हो और आप minority appeasement भी कर रहे हो. So it's like we are being beaten for opposing this form of secularism, and we are still paying for these minority religions. Like it's the worst of both worlds. Like you are paying the jizya and you're being called a bigot.
Right.
It's the worst of both worlds.
It is really such a perversion, and it is unfortunate that this has been allowed to continue for so many decades, and that's why that word has become very toxic today, actually.
True. Right. So from there, we'll now try to move towards wrapping this discussion up. And I want to touch upon the last chapter of your book, which is decolonizing the Indian state. So first thing, why do you think that we are still colonized, and in what sense do you use that word?
If you look at the structure of, so the state, obviously, there's the executive, there's the legislature, there is the bureaucracy, there's the judiciary. So broadly speaking, if you say there are four organs like that, let's leave aside the intelligence agencies, army, and so on for now.
Right.
But just looking at, the focus on that last chapter is on the bureaucracy and judiciary. So our case is that the bureaucracy in its current form today in India is in need of dire reform, primarily because the complexity of the economy has increased manifold over the last 70 years.
Right.
But the selection procedures, the training and sort of appointment procedures have not really been that way. So we moved from like a completely closed or autarkic kind of economy to quite an open economy, moving more and more towards like a liberal market model, and that requires specialty kind of training, special skills, and so on, for the bureaucrats who will staff those regulatory bodies. So, for example, can you, in a bureaucratic reshuffle, have someone who's, let's say, a steel secretary overnight become a finance secretary, and then the human resource development secretary or the education secretary now then becomes the commerce secretary in charge of all the trade related issues in India, negotiating with different countries and managing very complex policy matters. So that is how these members of the bureaucracy move around at the senior levels, and it's based on things like seniority. There is a very large in-kind compensation element. There is not a very large cash compensation element at the higher levels.
Right.
So if you're a senior bureaucrat, you get a nice bungalow, you get probably some cars and other amenities, household amenities and personal staff and those kind of things. But your kind of cash component of your compensation is much lower. So the case that we are making is we should have a higher cash compensation for the top level of the bureaucracy. And at the same time, the lower level of the bureaucracy is overpaid. If you compare the kind of tasks that the low level bureaucracy does to what a private sector job would pay, it is actually a very well paying job for the kind of role that it is, which is why you see a scramble in India whenever there is some recruiting going on for entry level posts in government. Then even advanced degree holders are applying for these jobs, and then the media headlines come that there's so much joblessness that even a PhD guy is wanting to become a clerk somewhere. But the reason that happens is the pensions, the benefits, the guaranteed employment system in bureaucracy makes these jobs actually very lucrative. You don't have to do much. You get paid very well, especially if you're living in small town India and like the hinterland, where the cost of living is really not that much compared to larger cities. Because of all these reasons, there is a need for dire need for administrative reform. And we haven't done too much of that. If you look at over the last 60, 70 years, there have been so many committees that have looked at this and said, this needs to change, this needs to change. But who's changing it? I think probably the Modi government has taken some initial steps into lateral entry in an organized fashion. And now we have some people coming in. But, for all these years, not much has really changed actually on that front. And we are continuing with the inherited sort of steel frame, which has now become a steel cage. And that is why we say that the state needs to be decolonized. And then that's the bureaucracy. So if we talk about the judiciary now, one of the great things that has happened in the last 25 years is kind of the decline. I would not say the end, but the decline of dynastic politics in the legislature and executive side. So till 1997, there was pretty much one family which had run the country, right? There was hardly anyone else who had been prime minister, who had controlled the levers of power in Delhi. But we've seen that change in the last 20 years. But if you look at the judiciary and if you look at the appointments process, again, in the higher echelons of the judiciary, the appointments process is not very transparent. There are hints of nepotism there, where if you connect the dots on who knows who and who's related to who, you quickly find that someone's nephew, son, daughter. Not too many daughters and nieces, unfortunately, because it's heavily male dominated even till date. But there are all these kind of relationships. Actually, there are intermarriages, and it's like a cabal onto itself, to be very honest. And that appointment process in the judiciary needs to be overhauled. The Narendra Modi government had tried to overhaul it, but then it was shot down by the judiciary itself, which said that the overhaul is against the basic structure of the constitution.
Right. Yeah.
So
that's the part of
self-invented doctrine. Yeah. So on both those aspects, actually, because of the appointments and incentives at play, our thesis is that India has a highly kind of still a pretty colonial sort of approach, and that approach needs to be reformed and made more democratic.
Right. So that's the point on more of a administrative decolonization. Harsh, do you have anything to add on that? Probably on ideological decolonization.
No, I do, but I think Gautam wanted to say something first.
Yeah, actually, this very important point I wanted to ask a question on, and I think Rajeev, you just touched upon it: the administrative reforms. So, whichever area I look at in when I look at India, whether it's digital payments, it's startup scene, agri reforms recently. There's so many areas to be very happy about, but there are a couple of areas, and one of those is administrative reforms. The size of the government actually hasn't really reduced. That's the area of despair, if you look at it from my perspective.
So
I think you touched upon it. You brought in.
I would just say, actually, Harsh, you want to talk about the government sizing and resizing and all that?
Okay, I'll just very quickly answer. I'll very quickly answer first Nilendra's point. I'll just briefly first add to what Rajeev basically said. It's not only very colonial, the state, it's also very centralized. So what has happened within the Indian government is, even though a lot of power has been devolved to state governments, and we can discuss that, there have been some setbacks as well, but broadly it has been devolved. It has not gone down to the local level. And even where it has occasionally gone to the local urban level, very, very occasionally, not compared to anywhere else in the world, in any democratic part of the world, it has absolutely not gone to the local rural level. And what I mean by that is, the very term of the IAS officer in local parlance remains collector. Collector is from the colonial time of the person who used to collect agricultural taxes. Now we don't have agricultural taxes. There are no taxes in the rural areas. That's part of the problem, because then anything that comes from the top they see is as manna from heaven. And therefore there's a lot of corruption, not a lot of accountability. There are no local taxes, and hence there's no local buy-in. Because I've worked in rural areas, I think the biggest problem is the local panchayats don't have any local taxes worth talking about. And so there is no real accountability to say ki maine tax diya, wo sarpanch kya kar raha hai. The idea is some money has come from the top, and even if the sarpanch has kept half, I am getting, the rest of the house is getting half. That is better than nothing, right? So it is in political economy, public choice, it is called the fly paper effect. Even if some stuff is flying, the rest is sticking, and that's fine. Anyway, so coming back to the broader point, first of all, of decolonizing our thinking, I think one larger point which kind of steps back from this chapter is, we say stop using left wing and right wing. These are terms come from the French Revolution, the French Parliament, and the Western American model more generally. In India, does not apply. All the debates of gay rights, abortion, and all that are either not so important in India, or actually the so-called right wing has done slightly more than the so-called left wing. I'm not saying the so-called right wing has done absolutely amazing, depending on one's point of view, but it has. These things don't apply in India. If there is a Sunni extremist in India who is against women's rights in many ways, I'm just giving an example. I'm not picking on any community, but let's say statistically he does not like the BJP, and he always votes against the BJP. So is he right wing or is he left wing? It does not make any sense, because his worldview is, we would call it social conservative, maybe to the extreme. But if he's always opposing the right-wing party, he's not right-wing, right? So these terms don't matter that much in India. India is, as you said, a civilizational state. Until the moment there is no consensus on that point, the civilizational party, which right now is the BJP, that is the vehicle of that, is called the right-wing party. That's a bit like saying Indian civilization is right wing. To be Indian civilization is to be a right winger, a civilizationist. And that is why there are such very frustrating but also very impressive debates within the so-called Indian right wing, because they are not debates between the right wing; they're debates within the Indian civilization. Because on the other side, as you rightly mentioned at the beginning, Nilendra, there are people who are denying that it's a civilization at all. So with that audience discussing what should happen going forward is almost futile, right? And vice versa for them, if they see rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, the word civilization as a mortal threat. Now, on the point of what Rajeev mentioned about the state, we want the Indian state to be not existent or small in most areas, but where it exists, it needs to be much bigger, stronger, and more effective. What I mean by that is very simple. As Rajeev hinted about the bureaucracy and the judiciary, I'll add a very simple point: policing. Again, there are not enough police officers and definitely not enough people arrested, incarcerated in Indian prisons as a percentage of the population of per 1,000. India is much below the median. Some place like America is much higher than the median. I'm not saying more is better. But clearly in India, there is especially in rural areas or smaller towns, there is a sense of reliance on self-policing. Now, broadly, in 99 out of 100 cases, it actually works very well. Indians are remarkably peaceful. If you walk through a Brazilian favela or slum, whatever they call it, I've been told by my friends, a lot of rich people get mugged. You can be a very rich Mumbaiker and walk through Dharavi, you'll be fine in most cases. India is a remarkable place in many ways, but what happens, especially where there are not many eyes on the road, it's not safe enough. Many local norms, often patriarchal norms, get forced on people, women, or anybody who dissents in the name of a Khap Panchayat, etc. There is not enough policing state capacity. So, for example, the government should focus on that as opposed to running hotels, right? So when people say big government, small government, that's not the question. In many ways, the number of government employees per lakh in India is actually very little. So we need much more expenditure on healthcare, education, policing, even though healthcare and education can be done with the incentives of a private sector, but the government has to subsidize it for the poor. But what we don't need are, for example, massive, Rajeev and I, the very first column we wrote together, besides one small financial column, was why does India need so many ministries? And we actually explored that in the book. And part of the reason is lack of internal democracy in Indian parties. But a large part is it's just make work for ministers to be accommodated. You have so many ministries approaching the same area, and there is deadlock. Now, it might be less of a problem in this government because the PM was very powerful.
There is no chemical and fertilizer minister in the UK, for example, right? There is a business secretary. There is a chancellor of the exchequer, but there is no, for example, steel minister or steel secretary or whatever, right? These are decontrolled industries. The government doesn't really have a role directly, at least. There have been some of nationalization in the last 5 years.
These ministries are to control this PSUs, those which remain from those sectors, like SAIL or whatever, RCF, those fertilizer factories. And they have basically become rent-seeking. Only recently, I just learned, Rajeev, that Jindal Steel or JSW, if I'm not wrong, just recently got the right to build steel for Indian Railways. Basically, SAIL for all these decades after liberalization was basically had a monopoly on making basically steel rails for Indian Railways.
And they were not satisfying the requirement, so they were not able to supply the required number of rails.
Even if they were, competition.
Okay. Steel is a very interesting space. So but I think we are going in a rabbit hole here now. If we'll keep going that path. So yes.
I just want to add one thing, Nilendra, if that's okay with you. To summarize, I would just say, we have to be very conscious of what is the proper role of government. True. Why should the Indian government become like a conglomerate, right? Like, why are we allowing the government to become like Tata Group, where one company, the Tata Group, is selling to another company, the Tata
Group? True. Right. So we have almost reached our time here.
One question. I think there were two questions I wanted to ask. One was about the size of the government, which you've answered. Again, just the variation of that question is that the government is big in areas where it should be small. And I think Harsh, you touched upon it. Why should government be running hotels or running airlines or selling, even BSNL for from my perspective, is not required. Government should not be in business to consumer services. It's very bad at doing consumer businesses, running consumer businesses, and it's not required to be in those businesses. Where it is supposed to be big, like policing, you touched upon it. And forget about just rural areas. If you look at the recent riots in Bangalore or Delhi, the police capacity is just not there to be able to respond to, somebody, a large crowd comes in and burns down the police station. Which modern country would tolerate it? And we don't have the capacity to handle that. So policing needs to be enhanced, and maybe we should cut down on agriculture procurement. Why should we have so many collectors, and why should a collector of a district be involved in procuring grains? That's just not, I think that's where it should. So I just wanted your thoughts on those topics.
No, I think the point of policing, and especially in the context of recent riots or the disturbance in Bangalore, is an excellent point. I was reading about these terrible, tragic terror attacks in Europe in the last few weeks. And you would read, the interesting thing is, at least as an Indian, I noticed, was somebody pressed some button for a police emergency, and the police was there in like 2 minutes. And I was like, even in Hindi films, in scenes, they don't come in 2 minutes, right? And my point is, imagine how many lives were saved because the police came relatively quickly and gunned down these dastardly terrorists. And imagine, we had scenes of in Delhi riots that one person with a gun out that became a headline photo. In Bangalore, there were people who had actually burned down a police station. Then they thought that they were doing a favor by actually protecting a temple or something, right? So these are classic case of under capacity. I fully agree with you. And then on the last point, procurement, Rajeev and we have written about agricultural reforms that just happened this year. Massive. There are still much more to do. But yes, I think in the short term, I think the government has actually increased procurement to kind of offset the political risk of the reform in the short term. So that's the economy is never economy; it's always political economy.
Right. So now, Harsh and Rajeev, we'll try to wrap up. Before we do that, I want to ask you that from the people who are planning to read this book or the readers, what are the key takeaways from this book that they can expect to get? So, your summary, your.
So I would not give a summary. I would simply say, if you want to really understand as an Indian or a non-Indian, as a resident Indian or a non-resident, where India is coming from and it is going, may I dare say slightly arrogantly on behalf of myself and Rajeev that it's a very comprehensive book. You will definitely disagree with many parts. That's fine.
Right.
But we have tried to be very rigorous in our research and have tried to kind of make sure that we footnote anything possibly controversial, double checked it. We've given it a lot of thought. So, and really, there is really no such book in the market, so to speak, which covers a wide range of areas like this one. So we've tried to present not a manifesto, an agenda, but a way to think of all these related areas. Rajeev?
Rajeev, anything you want to add to that?
No, and if I may say so, I think Harsh is absolutely right. I think, this book is like a crash course on the history and future of India, if I may say so. So, anyone who has a passing interest in India, who's interested or even learning deeply about the future of the country, or rather the past of the country and where the country's headed in the future, if you want to learn about that, get ideas on how to think about that, I think the book offers all of that in a variety of domains. So I think, any India watcher, Indophile would find this very interesting, I think.
Right. So thank you both of you to join us, and it was really wonderful talking to both of you, and I look forward to reading more from you guys, and good luck for your book. That's all. Thanks Gautam for joining in, and
thank you, Kendra.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you Gautam for inviting us again.
There are questions you may drop in and we'll take on a live chat or somewhere further again. We'll get you responses from these guys. If there is anything you want to follow them on Twitter, probably, if you want to ask them directly any questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.